The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. This is Tim Cusick. I'm the TrainingPeaks WKO4 product leader. Marco, that's hilarious. Thank you. You guys already knew my first question. I was going to say, if you can hear me, please type the question in the question box. Great stuff. That a way to keep us moving along. All right, excellent. Going to try to get moving here pretty quick today. As I posted in the Facebook group, I'm trying to shorten the webinars and get them down to a good 35 to 40 minutes in presentation and more Q&A. This worked out great yesterday. We got excellent Q&A, so I'm going to try to do the same process. As typical, please feel free to ask questions as we go. And I really encourage you to ask the questions. You know, a lot of times what ends up happening is I complete the webinar and then people email me or message the question. Don't be afraid to ask as you go. I tend to blend it right into the presentation. This way I can answer it while we're talking about it also. Always remember, as always, you know, a lot of what is presented is my opinion. You know, to me, I believe a lot of my philosophy when it comes to coaching and education and knowledge in general is, excuse me, everybody should go out and validate and learn on their own. I'm going to give some opinions, ideas. They'll generally, hopefully, be based in physiology and science and some different facts. But the reality is I wouldn't take anything on just face value. Go out and do the research. And it's something I'm encouraging more and more. So the reality is it's my opinion. Hopefully it's one that helps you think through or your own, but I would absolutely encourage you to go out and kind of figure out your own and adapt the philosophy that works for you. Excuse me one second. Okay, sorry about that. I just jumped off the trainer and still clearing it out of my lungs. All right, let's get started. First off with tonight's webinar, before I jump into the statement, this was a really challenging topic in the sense that when I put the topic choices in the Facebook group and let people vote, it really, I should have eliminated this one based on other choices. Because the reality is when we start talking about periodization of analytics, there's two realities. One, you might look at something more than something else, but the reality is you're always looking at sort of a 360 picture. It's not a hard science. It's more of an art of this leads you to that, you know, type of function. And the second part is the reality is I use what I call it a closed system, meaning if you've seen my season review, you've seen a decent amount of what I'm tracking throughout the season. I remember saying it in the season review I just did about a month ago, saying this is, you know, I'm looking at this all season long. You know, that's true. That is my workflow. So there's a certain amount of overlap. I'm going to attempt to not show the overlap, and I'm going to reference maybe some other webinars and only show you some new stuff or some of my thinking about how to handle periodization and then therefore how to do analytics and tracking. So with that introduction, let's jump right in. When we start talking about all training, I love this as a quote. I think it's just great because particularly as coaches, it forces us to really look at the whole system. An athlete performance isn't singular. It's not one facet. It's multifaceted. And this is a great quote because it basically, to read it, elite athletic performance involves the integration of muscular, cardiovascular, and neurological factors. And that's so true, right? You can't break any one thing down. And one of my fears about power data and analytics is we get very focused on one analytic and we just zone down in on that analytic. You can't do that. You need to look at a series of analytics. You could put 10 individual pieces of science in an analytic, but still it's the art of looking at them all together and understand what they're telling you. But the reality is that integration of muscular, cardiovascular, and neurological factors really is just the function of efficiently transferring energy from aerobic and anaerobic ATP turnover into velocity and power, right? You want to take energy and go faster. And one of the things that I've talked a lot about, I'm going to say it something, you know, here a decent amount, is one of the things I see in the cycling community as a whole is we mistake energy systems for other things, or we look at the result of an energy system as the driver, and we forget to go back to what's really the underlying reality. To do that, I have to give a little bit of background to jump into periodization of data analytics. Let's talk about periodization. Before we talk about it, one setup I highly encourage, and I do this in my Getting Started with WKO4 webinars, and you'll see examples of it here today. I really encourage you to set up your time ranges, your right-hand explorer where you have time. I break each season into 4 sections so that I can look at those sections individually, which are generally periodized, meaning the idea of linear periodization. So I use a base, build, and race or perform. You can see it here in 2000. So that's 3: base, build, race, and perform. And then I have an entire season function. I do that for each year. You can see here 2015 base, 2015 season, because it allows for a lot of the comparative that is really important when you're looking at data analytics by periodization, of which I'll show you a couple of examples. Periodization really is just an organized approach to training that involves progressive cycling of various and specific aspects of training. It's really all you're talking about. You're breaking things down into digestible chunks that are going towards the accomplishment of some bigger goal. Periodization, I think, is a great way to help people understand training and to be able to see an overview of a plan. And for me, with every athlete, the highest level pro to an everyday Joe that I might be working with, I always write a fully developed annual training plan. I use the TrainingPeaks system, just like I showed people in annual planning. I use a spreadsheet of support that I do personally too, that just goes a little deeper on some items. And then I present that, and it gives us a good overview. It gives a good clarity to the client. That being said, I use linear periodization because it builds clarity, right? When you think about linear periodization, it's the classic periodization images you see, of which I'm about to show you a couple. But the reality is that it's a good way to think about it, but it's not the best implementation in my opinion. I am not a major fan of classic linear periodization, even though I use it as the basis of my thinking. I'll give you a little more insight into that in a moment. I tend to take the idea of linear periodization and I blend it with periods of undulation, or even sometimes undulation or undulating periodization, and or reverse periodization. I'm not stuck on one approach. And part of what tweaks my approach, what changes it, how it evolves as we go, is the analytics themselves. And that's part of what I'm going to teach here, but it's also why I have to give some background and basis. Now, here's a word of advice which I strongly give. You don't have to strongly listen to me, but I'm giving it to you and saying, hey, this is really a pretty big secret for the coaches out there. And it's probably something most of you are doing anyway, but periodization planning gives the structure outline for review, discussion, presentation, focus, but ongoing activities must be guided by the relationship between training load, fatigue, and adaptation to introduced stimuli. The thing I see with all these new systems, including ours, I mean, we spent a lot of time, Dave Shell and the team did a great job with the ATP, and there's more improvements coming. And that's a great tool to use. But the reality is you better be careful about being overly dogmatic to it. Like once you write the plan, then you just execute the plan. I see a lot of people falling into that trap suddenly. And the reality is the analytics, the measurements, the other things are going to the wayside in the name of sticking to the plan. You've got to look, and I'll show you in my analytics, at how training load and load, notice I don't say training duration, there's all different types of load, fatigue and adaptation occur within there, and operate, and adapt, tweak that plan. Don't be caught being dogmatic. All right, let's talk about periodization. I have to give you a little bit of my overview of philosophy, which I'm going to tell you my opinion again, which might not jive with yours, but when I show you my analytics, it's important that you understand the underlying philosophy. First off, when I look at periodization, I do have a linear thinking, and I break everything down into athletic maturity, low, medium, high. By athletic maturity, I don't mean age maturity. I mean number of years they've been training with some serious intent. And I think what a low maturity athlete needs versus a high maturity athlete needs are two different things. Second, I do put them on a nice little grid. This is Google Sheets that this is in. The problem with that, it makes these perfect little squares, right? And perfect little builds like dot, 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 doot, dot, 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 doot. The reality is it's not always that way. This is meant to give a visual representation of increasing training load. Training load is here. And then of course, left to right, we have the countdown of weeks that are normally in a training plan. I'm trying to use color to give you some insight to intensity. So one of the places for me is I might start a plan 28 weeks out, might be 24 weeks out, might be 32, 33 weeks out. The reality is the training doesn't get serious really, and I'll define serious here in a little bit, until these final 8 weeks. One of the things that I see a lot of people do in periodization is they're doing too much work in here. It creates, and when I say too much work, we immediately go to too much intensity. No, I just mean too much work. Depends on what you're doing and how much work you've done historically, but too much can get done in here, and not enough ends up getting done here, but I'll explain that in a moment. So this is kind of my model for low maturity. You notice we're doing some work out here. As they move on to medium maturity, what you'll see, I reduce this number of weeks. There's no reason to carry that much workload for that long, because all you're actually doing is creating a level of chronic fatigue. Beyond what you see in a PMC, you have adrenal and CNS and things like that. So what you start doing as the athlete matures, you follow one of my training adages, is the best training is the highest adaptation for the least amount of fatigue. And how do I know if I'm moving it down too much? Well, that's again the role of testing, but I'll get into that too. For a high mature athlete, I don't do a lot of work this far out. And I've learned that lesson time and time again. It really depends. If they're racing a full male world tour season, I would have a different approach. Pretty much below male world tour, this is my approach. I want the least amount of work for the most amount of gain, and I'm not looking for huge significant gain here. Really, I want to start pushing it into this mode. There was a great article in Cycling Weekly, or one of the things, by Sagan's coach, and he talked about how Peter does cross-train, 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 but his biggest weeks are February. And if you think about that, I thought it was great, and I was hoping people really read it a couple of times, because this is what you're seeing. He's cross-training all winter, right? And then he gets into January, February, trains high, and he's in the spring classics right after that. So, the reality is he's not doing 30, 35 hours a week for 4 straight cycles, microcycles or macrocycles in this case. He's not spending 4 months of doing 26, then 27, then 28. He's cross-training, building, maintaining aerobic and anaerobic basis, some work and specialty work. Don't get me wrong, he's not just sitting on the couch. He's doing a lot of stuff. But then when gets time to get at it, he gets at it, gets to his peak, performs, rests, repeats that short cycle. So you have my 3: low, medium, high. So when we talk about periodization and the data, the way I interpret the analytics are very dependent on the athlete's maturity. So, and I'll mention that as we go. I do note for an athlete looking through a breakthrough season, like maybe they're an emerging pro or a young pro, sometimes you just have to take that, or maybe an older pro just making their breakthrough, and you have to crush them. You have to go really deep in the training to get maximum efficiency and economy and development of systems and other things. If you're doing that every year, you're making a huge mistake. It usually, it's Dean Golich always likes to say what it takes to get there is not what it takes to stay there. So just an idea, I do have a 4th periodization, which is basically called breakthrough, which is really break you. And that's just a heavy load. So the athlete tends to do a lot of racing under heavy fatigue, and they don't perform as well. But the reality is it really pushes all the systems for the next year for them to push through. So in the end of the day, as we get into the actual analytics, I'm going to repeat it one more time. Don't be dogmatic. You have to tweak. All these systems are nice little boxes and colorful little whatever. And there's the solution, right? I bet you people took screenshots here and said, there it is. That's just how you start your thinking. That's how you outlay your season. You need to be able to adapt based on the relationship of load, fatigue, and adaptation. When I look at the season, I really break it down into 2 periods. I have 3 here because I'm going to explain what I'm doing in here. But the reality is all of my training in these early phases is really, I just call it fitness. And all I'm really doing is getting you as fit as possible to be prepared for what I call performance readiness training or performance training. So this is all getting you maximally fit so you can handle this. And it's kind of funny. It's, one of the ways I like to talk about it is it's like all training is adaptation. It's like hitting somebody with a hammer. Well, here you're hitting them softly with the rubber mallet. Here you've got them on the anvil and you have out your sledgehammer. And not too much, I got to be careful of what I'm saying there, but I think you get the point. This is all basis of development, really preparing for this. This phase can go either way here. I don't believe in doing performance training more than 8 weeks for an athlete. And I think that's another significant mistake I see in periodization. They're doing, 4 full cycles of VO2 max and anaerobic work. If you're doing 4 full cycles of VO2 max and anaerobic work, you're not, a decent dosage of it. You're not peaking. You're not going to hit a peak. You're really just creating fatigue. That isn't going to be productive or non-functional overreaching in that phase. You really want 8 weeks of intensive. That doesn't mean you don't do some building up and you're preparing. So that's what I mean by pre-readiness. So what am I focusing on in those phases? In the fitness perform phase, which is what we're going to talk about today, is we're talking about aerobic development, capacity and power, cardiovascular development. One of the things, this came up as a bunch of questions last night, so I'm going to tackle it right off the gate here, right out of the gate. We say aerobic in our world of endurance training, and we immediately translate to cardiovascular. They are highly related, but not the same thing. Aerobic performance and aerobic development is a group of other things as part of it. It's not just cardiovascular. Oxygen uptake, and oxygen utilization is part of aerobic development, but aerobic, in my view and in the way it's typically looked at, is more of a reference to the underlying energy system, where cardiovascular development is more of a specific reference to the what I call uptake intake, how much oxygen and we're getting into the system and how much we're able to absorb. Also during this period, I look at efficiency and economy. It's funny, and I'm going to tackle it, much maybe to some people's chagrin, because I posted it in Facebook. Efficiency economy I work on it here. It's hard to track because really those are lab data. It's one of the few pieces of data we have a struggle creating a model for. But yet there's some things that I'll show you to look for, and it's something worked on. I'm looking at stamina. I use the term broadly. It's it's muscular endurance, it's energy system stamina. It's different. It particularly can vary based on the demands of your event and your natural ability. And as you've heard me say, I do fatigue resistance. I'm not going to cover stamina and fatigue resistance because there's already 2 existing webinars on those. The reality is, I'm just going to reference you to go back and look at those because I'll show you a quick couple of slides, but I'm not going to go deeply because it's covered somewhere else. One last caveat, you have to test to make everything I'm about to show you work. And you see me defend it in Facebook, people say, well, we're just testing to maintain a model. No, you're testing to have all these metrics and to understand the relationship of evolving and ongoing performance so you can tweak, so you can adjust your training underneath that plan and not be dogmatic to the plan. So everything I'm about to show you will not work if you don't start the season with a baseline test, of which I use the classic 5-second, 1 minute, 5 minute, 20 minute, and I actually add a 40 minute. I do 1 test per day, and I separate the 20 and 40 so they're not back to back because I want maximal performance. And I'll do that over the course of the first week of a season, a training season. Now, of course, the athlete's pretty unfit, but that's their max based on their fitness, and that cleans up my model. The reason I'm doing that is now I have a mean maximal power basis, and I have all the power duration metrics. It's not just maintaining the model. I now understand what Pmax and FRC and all these things are, so that as we begin to introduce more training exercise stimuli, I actually have an accurate understanding of the adaptation. If the starting point isn't right, it takes you a couple of months to flush out that initial bad data. Then every 4 to 6 weeks, with me it's 4, I'm doing unstructured testing as I've showed it in the past. So when we look at the periodization, just breaking those periods down again, let's focus on the base period, which is what I had here. And I'm going to start with aerobic and cardiovascular. I'm going to kind of tackle those together. And a lot of people have seen my presentation on building FTP and I forget whatever that webinar was. FTP might be Stamina or something like that, but it's the FTP webinar where I give the example of using this fitness phase, this base, extended base, as a grow as aerobically tall in your house as possible. People ask me a lot, well, what is your target? Like, how do I know? Well, again, there's a bunch of different data that I know, but let's start with that. So to me, and I'll try to give good examples, this is a younger female pro just starting her season. You could see here, this is actual live data. This is live data. Nobody was harmed in the capture of this data. And they started around 10-15 into this season. So the reality is this chart, and by the way, and I'll post it again after the next question. In the chat box, I post a link to all the charts that I'm showing today. I'm trying not to load every single chart to the library because we're ending up with a lot of variations of the same thing. If you want the link, ask me in the question box right now, and the first person, I'll post it, and then I'll make it so everybody can get it. So this is my aerobic development chart, and this is how I do my targeting. This is, on this side, what I'm looking at is, in this period, I do use heart rate in the base training period. We always have to understand that heart rate is variable, it's subject to variables, and it is a trailing indicator. But I also think, as we're obviously looking at aerobic, heart rate is an excellent substitute for O2 uptake, an understanding of pump and stroke volume. It does give us some good data to use. I just don't use it like each point of data isn't exact. I'll only use it when it's in trend or trend establishment. What I'm tracking here is aerobic efficiency, or EF in the expression. So I'm looking at the greatest 10 of all time. I'm looking at the average 10 of all time in their time range. But then I build a chronic target of AE. And what a chronic target is I look back for a certain amount of time, depending on the athlete maturity. On the charts that I shared in the chat box, I think I used 2 years. Look at it. It's days, so you'll see the right number of days, which is kind of mid-level. For a younger athlete, I might use just 1 to 2 years. For a more mature, for a medium-aged athlete, let's say in their 30s, I'll use 3 years. By the time they get close to 40s, I'm back to 2 years. And what I'm doing with that chronic target is I'm basically looking at what point is there a chronic plateau, a point where they cluster. So it's a form of looking at cluster into a top percentile. And you could break percentiles into equal groups like quintiles and things like that. I tend to use a percentile because it just plays out a little cleaner. So I will continue my general focus of aerobic, assuming we have a forward-moving trend, until we're at least over the chronic load. That doesn't mean as soon as we break chronic, it's like, we're there, and I stop. But I start really focusing on the possibility of diminishing returns once we go above chronic. This is a non-pro. My chronic targets are harder for a professional athlete. This is a young pro. So, and I can tell because I can already see there's a pretty good gap between greatest top 10 of all time and the target. Same here on VO2 max. I'm treating it the same way. So I can see we just started training, right? We've been training for what, 2 weeks? So we have a chronic target. She's not very aerobically fit at the moment, but we see it moving. I'm not using a trend line, which I will show you in a minute, but we can see it moving. But she's got some room to keep building that aerobic engine before we can feel pretty good, about she's getting close to maximal returns. And then over here, I'm doing the same with modeled VO2 max. I've run the same kind of equation. I have a max of all time. Whenever I use heart rate, I always use top 10 because heart rate's too variable. And here I'm just using max of all time. I'm doing the same equation to build a chronic load. So what I'm looking for out of this phase, is one, continue forward moving progress, clearly, but two, that gives me some insight. I want to at least get over the chronic, and I want to keep pushing to maybe even exceed the all-time max, hopefully, actually. But the reality is I become hypersensitive to diminished returns once we break a chronic target. Hopefully that makes sense. So it really tells you when to really start focusing on, wow, should I evolve? Should I make that next step into harder workouts? How I'm tracking that as we go, and I'm going to show you a bunch of charts here in the annual view, and then I'll tell you which these are, because the annual view often gives you the big picture. You can see the whole thing. So Karen asks, how do I determine chronic targets? I can't paste. Karen, download the chart. You'll see it formulaically. It'll make perfect sense. I'm actually looking at a 2 or a 3-year running history. Again, I think the chart I loaded is a 2-year history, and I'm basically taking a top percentile. So I'm averaging tops, breaking into a quintile, actually, I think in that, and then looking at a percentile. So really you're just talking about until it gets in the range, the cluster of top performances. But it's pretty clear in the formula. It's nothing all that fancy. So annually, right, I'm tracking, this is a separate professional woman. This is 2016-17 season as a whole. This is and I'm going to expand on some other charts. And this was training. This woman raced a little later last year, then had to take some time off, had a little minor surgery, and you see that coming here, but basically did a little riding, gets back at it here, and you can see exactly what you want to see, right? We see purple dots are VO2 max, the dash is the trend line. This athlete was gaining VO2 max all year long, which is excellent. The blue dots are aerobic efficiency. The title of the chart is Aerobic Development. Yeah, there's sometimes I cut the title out, but I'll start fixing it now. It's in that download I sent you. So this is aerobic efficiency, and you can see the dots showing each day, and the trend line you can see positive. There's an interesting note happening here, right? This athlete, their aerobic efficiency is improving faster than their VO2 max. So this is a person who really had a good year. The reality is we were able to grow VO2 max to a pretty good number, and throughout the entire season, they were growing aerobic efficiency. So just stepping away from this example for a moment, here comes the chart title, Aerobic VO2 Review. That's what it is. So I think for the rest, I remember to capture the chart title. This is a World Tour pro having a bad year. So just so you know, it happens to, this is a male World Tour. So he's got some higher VO2 max here because he raced the Vuelta. Had a pretty good Vuelta, actually. And, carries over the rolling 90s, taking some time off in here. He kind of gets back at it in here. Isn't wearing his heart rate monitor early. I'll show you why, or I'll show you what happens. And look what happens. His VO2 max never really rebuilds. And as a matter of fact, there's something going on with his aerobic system, and he had a really tough year. So it played out. I'm not going to show a lot of his examples because his data is so unique. Genetically, it's crazy what a World Tour male pro can do, or World Tour female pro both can do, but the raw numbers of a male are crazy numbers. Now let's go back to the female. So also a different way of looking at it, and you have aerobic VO2 review, is this is a different woman. You can see there's this is the same woman. Sorry, I should have marked it. But the reality is this, I use the VO2 review. This is the actual chart I use for my reviews. And I'm tracking the same two things, but what I've done here, and hopefully you can see the shading. Usually you can't see it well enough in these go-to meetings, but load the chart. And I'm really just breaking down by time they're spending close to VO2 max in their training. So basically the brighter it is, the harder, more time that they're spending in VO2 max. And there's actually a little line. I don't do the high level one. I don't do as a bar. I do as a line. You can just see it tracing through there. So this gives me an understanding and look for patterns. Like look at this pre-build stage, little medium stuff, good, safe, simple build. The reason you can do that, right, is, and now I'm trying to show chart names and I'll show you a little bit. I'm not trying to hide anything. I'm trying to leave as much screen, but you can also see what I'm doing here. So I compared this against 2007 base, which for the sake of this meeting, I aligned at the same start date, which isn't always true. So the background reds are 2016 or 2017 season. This is just base for her, so we have that as mid-November to February. Look what happened to her in base last year. Her VO2 max was actually going down. I wasn't working with her. Her VO2 max was actually going down, but her aerobic efficiency was sort of coming up, right? So something else was happening there. She had some other issue that was not going right. Her aerobic seemed to be trending okay, but it wasn't paying off in her ability to really put out the power and do things. The charts, you guys, they're located in the chat box. It won't let me cut and paste a solution in here. If you don't get them, email me after and I'll make sure. But I put it in the chat like while you guys were waiting. So there's a chat box, just look in there. What you're seeing right now, though, in this 2018 base, but it's only 2 weeks old, right? Maybe 3 weeks old. Here we do have VO2 max going in the right direction. Its raw number isn't as high, but it's going in the right direction. And her aerobic efficiency numbers are already responding more positively, better, steeper, stronger. Now, would I say, wow, success after 3 weeks? Absolutely not. But remember, this idea is we're periodizing what we're tracking, and this is what I'm tracking. Do I want that and both to keep going up? Absolutely. But as I start looking at them as periods, right, I'm looking for points of deflection. If that line starts changing, if the slope changes, then I'm getting concerned about diminishing returns, and it might be time to move on. Match that with what I'm telling you about chronic targets, and you start to see, what Tim is doing is he has a target based on the athlete history, and he has a target based on the athlete history, and he has a trend of how the athlete's performance. And we're making sure, not only do I know the target, right? And here, remember, we're talking about aerobic and cardiovascular, but not only do I have a target, then I have supporting analytics that let me know I'm moving towards that trend. All right, I'm getting numerous questions about where the chat box is. At the end of the session, I'll repaste the drop. I got to go back into my Dropbox and get the link. For some reason, it won't let me paste it, but I'll do it at the end. So just go ahead and watch the presentation, and then I'll get you the charts when you're done. At a workout level, I look at a classic workout, and the next webinar, which I'm totally excited to do because I've never done it and didn't dawn on me, is how to review a workout. But one of the things when I'm really looking at making sure everything's trending in the base period and aerobically and cardiovascularly, I look at the cardiac drift chart. And I'm looking at cardiac drift and actual change. I don't actually track it. Somebody asked me last night, do you track that at the athlete level? And it's like, no. This is why sometimes it's hard to do these webinars. There's a lot of your process, everybody, that you have in your head, right? I mentally track it. I kind of know when like that's an oddball one, or I just keep thinking about it in my head. Well, that's getting better for my athlete, but I haven't done that yet, and I guess I should, but I just haven't. It's just one of those things. I developed a habit of looking at it. It became part of my process, and I guess I haven't formalized that yet. But here's interesting, right? You see, this is just a progressive endurance ride. The person's just riding endurance, pretty steady and going a little harder. There's actually some bursts in here. Their change in power, so their heart rate goes up 22%. Their change in power is 11%. But if you look at power to heart rate or decoupling, that's negative 0.171. We don't need that many numbers. So you see a tale of two cities kind of happening there, right? I just kind of like to look at cardiac drift. I can make my own equation of power. I find decoupling works well, and it's fine. I just like the idea. I don't know, it's just a habit, so I'm just showing you. I do look at the development of aerobic power, and there's a bad equation in this one of these screenshots, which I fixed in the chart pack that I'll share with you. It's already shared in the Dropbox. I just need to share the Dropbox. And I'm showing you 17 season versus 16 season for one of the female pros. To be honest, I'm not sure who this is. Yes, I am. So, okay. So when you start talking about power, MFTP or FTP is a power, right? So their 2016 was 256, 2017 was 2, and I'm just running annual or season time range against one another. So they got stronger. Power at aerobic, sustained aerobic effort, aerobic endurance went up. Their VO2 max went up. Power at VO2 max went up. Well, VO2 max went up, so we'd expect those to go up. One of the things that I look at, but there's no physiological basis. It doesn't quite work this way, but I always think about, well, what's the percentage gain here versus the percentage gain there? But that really, I don't talk to that. It's just a little, math I'm doing in my head. One of the things I look at, I'm going to show this chart in a moment, is power at 150. I also look at power at 170, for a professional athlete, beats per minute. There is some insight to be gained about, if you think about heart rate, right? Heart rate tells you a lot, pump volume. Tells you what a trailing response to the effort. It gives you insight into energy burn and blah, blah, blah. But also it is an indicator of O2, of oxygen uptake as a whole. So if you start thinking about it, you loosely could say economy, which is O2 uptake divided by power, could be thought about with heart rate. It's not clean, and Kevin and I have kicked, as a matter of fact, again this week we were kicking around some different ways to do it and experiment with it, but it's not something, we're working with a couple of other people on doing it. It's just not something the physiologists are sound with and other people are sound with, so we haven't kind of put anything out. But I still track power at 150 and 170 beats. So this athlete went from 181 to 188 at 150. I'm looking at their EF. And I also put a little bit of training content. I want to see that, again, against VO2 max, what was their training. You could do this against FTP or MFTP or other factors, whatever floats your boat. We can see this person spend a little more time up here and a little less time down here. That's not a bad blend for a season, so there's nothing that jumps out as abnormal there. So that gives us an understanding of development. You can then look at that at base. Now, here's what's interesting, right? Remember, this is a different woman, not the one that's 2 weeks into base. This woman's about 4 weeks into base, or actually about 5 weeks into base now, because she's racing the Tour Down Under, so on a little bit different schedule. There was her 2017 base FTP. Here's her 2018 base. And she's really, knock on wood, setting up to have a nice year. The reality is, this is aerobic power. We haven't been, I track this as part of it. We're not doing a lot of other work. So a lot of it's being in response to aerobic training. We see nice movements in her VO2 max, good movement at power, good movement at percentage. This is a huge room for her to grow. And I would hope, last year we couldn't get this to like 82. Reality is we actually trained the breakthrough periodization with her last year, so I crushed her all year long. She was never rested enough to really hit it. This year we're on a much lighter, more quality style program, and you can already see she's breaking through and gaining from it. Here was the bad formula. There's just something that's odd in there. It's odd in the other report too. It wasn't accurate. But it is fixed in the one that I'm going to share with you. I fixed it before I sent it out. I just forgot to take new screenshots. Here you see the EF. Her EF is still a little lower, which tells us power is interesting. She still has room to grow, right? And in base period to base period, she's doing a little more work in this mid-range, but less intensity work. Hint, hint, a little more work in the mid-range, but less intensity work. So, she really is approaching and going. So when I start looking at aerobic development, the power side of it, not just capacity, which was back there, we feel good about, you would feel good about this moving forward. This is aerobic development. Oh, man, I should have had the name of this chart. Again, it's in that pack. Sorry, I can't believe I cut that out. The reality is, I'm kind of looking it up on my Mac on my other screen as I talk. What we're basically doing here is, and I think probably most people have looked at this, we're scatter plotting heart rate versus power and building certain averages of that and points of intercept and intersection. You will see in this that that's the power numbers where we're getting those the 150 BPM. I originally built this, and then I think Coley Moore put improved intercept and slope angles, which give us a little insight into uptake and uptake speed. The reality is most of my focus is happening here, but you can see this chart as the intersection points move. At 150 beats, this athlete put out 7 more watts. You could technically, well, I'm sorry, I shouldn't say, you could loosely associate that with economy. And economy is so important for professional racers, almost more than efficiency, because efficiency is part of economy. And I'm going to explain that later. So at least we have 76 people who get it. And then you can tell the rest of the Facebook world. So that's my cardiovascular stuff. I do other things. Watch the review when you see all my basis of cardiovascular review and this and that. I just didn't want to, redo it. Great question, Karen. All right, that's a really good question. Karen asks, at 150 beats per minute, what intensity level would this athlete be? Probably they would be low tempo. Nah, I'm trying to think who it is. Actually, I have her on my other screen. Yeah, it would be kind of high endurance. Yeah, kind of high endurance. Yep. Yeah, I don't have her heart rate levels in WKO4. I'm so bad. What does the CV stand for here? Cardiovascular. So to me, I've been saying aerobic. Here's where I'm really trying to look at heart rate and delivery of oxygen. So the reality is, right, and I'm going to show this. Hold that question. I'll show you what I mean in a different section because when I talk about economy and efficiency. So let's move on to economy and efficiency, or efficiency and economy. One of the things that and I'm going to soapbox you guys, and everybody could mute me if you don't like it. There's so many people out there in the world, so many companies that want to sell you stuff that has to do, that might be helpful, but the way the marketing machines present it, they're using terms that confuse or can confuse you. And it really is unfortunate, and it's becoming more of a personal frustration for me. And I'm trying to partner with these groups to clean it up and to accurately look at data because it can be useful stuff. It's just the misuse of terminology. Because now is what's happening. A lot of coaches and a lot of people who should know better are starting to use that terminology, and things are getting worse because then now people are starting to think about some of the things that come out of it as effective training. So when I'm looking at economy efficiency, I didn't just put that in here because this has just come up again in our Facebook group, but it's a really important in the base period that as your athletes get to a certain point of performance, and I bet most people know this, what I'm about to say here, understanding that you can get gains in efficiency and economy become more important. Efficiency is important because you can gain about another 5%. There's not a huge room to grow, but as you become to the professional ranks, you have to find those 5%. If you're an everyday Joe training 8 to 10 hours a week and you're spending a lot of time trying to think through efficiency and how to gain it, you're probably better off just riding your bike a little harder. You're not going to get enough gain to really make a big difference at that level. The more you get serious, the more you go professionally, that's important. Economy, though, and you start talking about performance, can have a bigger effect, and I'm going to show you why. But we have to be able to know what these terms mean and how to develop them and then how to sort of track them, because technically they only can be tracked in a lab, but I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into how to track them. So let's start with economy, because for the everyday cyclist, economy can actually have a bigger effect than efficiency. But because the word economy has become so bastardized and so wrong, we've actually ended up with a counterintuitive prescription. So economy is power produced in watts divided by the volume of oxygen used to produce that power, typically in liters per minute. That's the simplest physiological definition from economy. That's Dr. Andrew Coggin's definition. I literally took it from one of his PowerPoints he sent me. The reality is it's kind of like your gas mileage that you're getting. You typically use 70, 80 watts per liter consumed per minute. When you burn carbs, you are more economical burning carbs. So right off the bat, that's going to confuse people right there, because we have fat burning, fat oxidation, Krebs cycle, all those things that go with that. That doesn't mean it's the best way to move down the road. It's not the best way to maybe win the Tour de France, but understand that when you're burning carbs, you're actually more economical. And for generally all lower outputs of power, let's say threshold and below, or actually really what you would class about 105% of threshold and below. Lower cadence is more economical. It always is. And it's funny, people go, what? Everybody's working on high cadence. But probably every cyclist and every good coach knows the kind of classic statement, right? If you pedal slower, it's more muscular, more stress on the muscular system. If you pedal higher, it's more stress on the aerobic system. And that's true, right? So all we're saying, you're only showing the science of what's actually true. So remember that, because I'm going to come back to it in a minute. Efficiency is even easier in the sense of understanding what it is. It's the amount of energy produced divided by the amount of energy needed to produce work. So in its simplest thing, it's energy in, energy out, but it's really energy out, energy in. So times 100% to give it a number, that's efficiency. Truly, it can only be measured in a metabolic chamber, even though there's people, and I've seen some really good models coming out about efficiency, which can be game changers if it works. We're working on one, don't get me wrong, but it's hard. Cycling efficiency represents the link between ATP turnover and external power output. So you're burning energy, you're turning over ATP, you're producing energy, and what's the power result? A more efficient individual will be able to produce a given power output at a lower metabolic rate. That's why they call it efficiency. But efficiency is an element of economy. The metabolic rate demonstrates itself in performance by less O2 demand, less energy utilization. So in a simple way, if you had two riders, Jane and Jill Ryder, they weighed exactly the same and they had exactly the same VO2 max. If they both went 175 watts and Jane was producing that 175 watt at 80% of her VO2 max and Jill was producing 175 watts at 85% of hers, Jane has better economy, of which efficiency would create that. It's part of the formula, but Jane has better economy. So Jane can go longer, harder. Jane has more in the tank when it's time to go harder. Jane can finish stronger. Now remember, same, right? Same VO2 max. And I could have normalized that, weight to VO2 max, but it's economy that could be a significant difference maker. And that coupled with fatigue resistance are kind of the lost thing in coaching. And this is my final soapbox slide, I promise. Then I'll show you a little tracking, but there's no great tracking. But at least if you know what you're looking for, or if you want to know how to solve it, it's different. So you also have biomechanical efficiency, biomechanical factors that affect efficiency. Saddle height affects efficiency. And most people know that. If not, Google search it, you'll learn. If you had one thing wrong in your bike fit that is hurting you, saddle height is it. That could hurt you. Saddle height is it. Hurt you from an energy production way. Cadence has an effect. I've already showed you that. And there is a muscular fibotype, but that really is biochemical. It's the action that's happening as you're making this energy, what it takes to get to the ATP development and use. Things that don't affect biomechanical efficiency, everything I'm about to tell you is absolutely proven, and proven time and time again. Crank length doesn't matter. Pedal position doesn't matter. Patterns of force, meaning do you pedal in a nice equal circle, doesn't matter. It's not the efficiency that a lot of modern pedaling systems are tracking. So when you hear Garmin has pedaling efficiency, at least it's pedaling efficiency. It's not efficiency. It's something totally different. But the reality is, if you have your athletes doing a lot of work to pedal greater circles because you'll think they'll be more efficient, you won't. As a matter of fact, more recent studies are showing, and this has already been consistently proving, if you're working too hard on making a perfect circle, you're less efficient. And I bet you a third of the people, half the people here already know this. Half the people, you see all this marketing hype and you don't look at it this way. If you're working hard to pedal that circle, then you're probably burning more energy to pedal the circle than you are if you would just apply force to the pedal in the way your body wants to. And don't trust me. Google it, learn, watch the discussion that's now going on Facebook. You have well-known people in there not using right words and not answering the question right because it looks like, everybody make their own decision. How you measure it, one way you can measure it, right? And this is soft measurement, but I track it, and I actually find it pretty indicative of improving efficiency and economy out of the athlete. And then it will semi-correlate. I do, one of my women has free access to the lab, so it's kind of cool because I can connect that, what I'm kind of tracking with lab work at times, so it helps. There is a work and power review pack, and I already circulated that to you. What it is, it's really just 3 different. You can actually, in my real pack, I have more, but it's different times though. You can make what you want. I'm looking at work and power over 20, 40, and 60 minutes. This screenshot, I had to clean this up. This should say kilojoule. I forgot to update this, but the one in your pack, I fixed it. It's kilojoules. So the reality is what I'm looking at here is mean max power 20 minutes from every workout, mean max work 20 minutes. So this should be 145 kilojoules. And then I'm looking at mean max normalized power for 20. I'm doing the same for 40 and the same for 60. But I'm measuring the change in time range. So that's what this is. By using SLRB functions, I'm measuring a starting point and an ending point for the time range, and I'm understanding change. So one, you can see in the trend line, it's going in the right direction, but I can actually put a number to that change. What I do, I did not include it here because I don't know, I was trying to keep some secrets, I guess, but then enough people asked me, I just said it last night. I track that by week, and I just make a chart of that weekly change, and I want to see it continuing to grow forward. When it stops growing forward, I take a deep dive look at the training stimuli that I'm introducing. If you were to click on the title and blow one of these up, this is what it looks like. This is the 20-minute one. Of course, when I took the picture, it didn't put watts in here, but you can see I'm looking at the change in the time range, and each one is just a daily workout. In my actual analytics, I summarize this by week. So I have a chart of each week what it's doing, and I'm making sure that it's growing each week. That gives me an understanding of efficiency, of which is part of economy. That's the real efficiency that I'm tracking. Now, somebody asked me last night, well, what type of workouts do you do to do that? Here's why the whole pedaling thing can be tough to deal with at times. I do a lot of high cadence work. There's no evidence that shows exactly, the pedal stroke is the deal, but there is evidence that gives you understanding that high cadence work does improve efficiency, and really 2 reasons. One, you just have a higher cadence. You have a higher neuromuscular response. Neuromuscular, how fast your muscle contracts and expands. So everybody here knows what a watt is, right? How hard you pedal times how fast you pedal. We spend a lot of time practicing how hard we pedal. We don't spend enough time practicing how fast we pedal. And the reality is, if you practice how fast you pedal, you have a neuromuscular and a neurological, a rate coding, look up rate coding response, and your brain just gets better at contracting and expanding those muscles faster, and the muscle gets better at that. So you improve efficiency. So I do low inertia, high cadence work, rollers with little resistance, trainers with little resistance, slight downhill pedaling at all types of different high cadence ranges. And some are high cadence over time, as simple as 5 minutes on, 5 minutes off. And some are what I call cadence shifting, which is pedal as fast as you can and then go downhill and pedal even faster, or pedal as fast as you can, then suddenly shift into an easier gear and pedal even faster. Because the reality is, to raise efficiency, you have to train inefficiently so your body would adapt. And what I mean by that is, if you're really good at pedaling 110, you can pedal 110 RPMs all you want. You don't get more efficient. You have to go up to 125 where you're inefficient. You're choppy, you're square, you're whatever. So you need some inefficiency training, right? So that your body then takes that and adapts. If you were playing a team sport, or if you were playing a court sport, they would call that coordination, by the way. It's a different form of it. It's all you're really doing is training a muscular response to be part of the game. And in cycling, we think force, 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 torque, torque, torque. But there's other parts of that game that can be done. Karen asks, is the change Monday through Sunday? Yeah, Karen, I do everything Monday through Sunday just because it keeps my brain. I don't have enough horsepower to do it differently. My mind's too challenged. Even though there's actually some merit, and I bet you I know why you're asking to not doing it Monday to Sunday. So it's a really good question, but I do it Monday to Sunday because I'm also not looking at it as absolute. it's trend. I really am more concerned about the trend. You could easily see this on, you could easily see here's all I'm doing. Again, this is where it goes back to, it's so important to look at these base versus base. Now I'm looking at this trend, right? So yeah, it's getting kind of busy and the trends look a little better for this year, but I could actually put a number to change this year versus last year. Now last year, remember, that was a whole base period, and here we only have 2 weeks. I can tell this is my other female woman pro. But the reality is I'll be able to track it through the season. And are we closing in on last year's numbers and getting better? I would expect at some point we would go beyond what last year is and be better. Maybe not, but that only forces me to look at what I'm doing. Remember, you go back to, then I have to analyze my training. So what happens if I, on a chart like this and the cardiovascular, I get 6 weeks into my program and I'm not trending up, or I'm trending flat, or I'm trending down? That forces me to reevaluate. That doesn't mean I abandon the strategy, even though it probably does to some degree. I wouldn't call it abandon, but it means that I reevaluate. So when you're using data analytics to track progress to this phase, I'm looking at aerobic, cardiovascular, economy, efficiency, and fatigue resistance, which I'm about to talk about. But when those things start going wrong, I want to assess that right away. It's funny, I dropped out that one slide, but remember that World Tour male pro I showed you? I mean, this is a person, a World Tour, Grand Tour racer. At what point do you think they might have adjusted? This is their base period. Look at the dates. So they started training here. They had a little carryover from the Vuelta. They're in the base period. Everything's going the wrong direction. And if I showed you the whole year looks worse. No one was using analytics, even at that level, to say, oh crap, we better start thinking about. And by the time he got into summer, his season was done. He had a miserable year, and it's actually an article on VLO News about it. So back to that. So again, the point is, when I get there, I'm using these. I have targets I'm shooting for. I use chronic as my target, chronic load as a target. I want trend going forward. If 1 week or 2 weeks off, I don't panic. When I start to see 4 to 6, and particularly at 4, I wouldn't call it panic, but man, you have my attention. I'm laser locked into, I'm reevaluating what I'm doing. I'm looking at levels of fatigue. I'm talking to the athlete. I'm reading their notes and making sure I'm not missing the qualitative data where they're saying I'm tired, or I'm hurting, or maybe I'm just going so easy I'm bored. Who knows? But I'm looking at all that, and I'm beginning reevaluation of that point. Yago asks an awesome question. How do you differentiate kilojoules from watts? They're calculated slightly differently, but yes, a joule is a watt. You can certainly track them, and they have a tracking. They're in alignment here. The metabolic tracking of kilojoules is slightly different because it's based on normalized power in that sense. So you have a better, it really is the same thing. You could just use a watt and use it as a joule or a straight conversion to joule. So either way, you would end up with the same answer. But I'll show you something fatigue resistant that gives you a little better insight. So finally, we have fatigue resistance. You guys, I did a whole piece on fatigue resistance, so I didn't show you a bunch of charts. I really use this chart. This is one of my go-to charts. I use it all the time with my athletes. I'm always trying to close the gap. This is one of those pro women. You can see that they have a pretty big gap between the peak 20 minute and 20 minutes after only even 1,500 kilojoules, this person's dropping off. So many times you see young professionals entering the system, and they got the goods. They can make some power. This is a maybe 55 kilo woman. So, is getting there and building power, but she won't win with that type of a drop off. If you take somebody like Amber Neben, Amber, who none of these charts are hers, is her drop off at 20 minutes after 2,500 kilojoules is less than 5 watts. She's mature, she's efficient, she's economical. It's just a difference. So I'm using this all the time, and I'm tracking it, and I'm actually training for improvements in it. It depends on how long they're racing. 1,500 kilojoules for a U.S. domestic woman is a good number. the reality is, I might say different for a world tour female and a world tour male, but there's all different charts in that. It's already well done in the fatigue resistance. The other key metrics I showed you in my season review, so I don't want to go too deep, the same reality. I'm just looking at peak numbers. I'm looking at max kilojoules. Power in kilojoules will go up the same, but I'm using the calculation of work here, and it gives me insight into that performance of burned kilojoules. So you realize a kilojoule and a watt are the same. The utilization of energy is you have to go through the whole equation. But the reality is, when you talk about efficiency, we have about a 25% efficiency. It mathematically works out to be very similar. But it's good to be able to see that and it's always going to be correlated, as the athlete can go more power, they burn more kilojoules. What really is interesting when you look at it comparatively with certain athletes, and you begin to understand that it's the variable could be their actual efficiency, which again you would need a metabolic lab to measure. I look at peak 5 and 20 minutes after 1500 kilojoules. It might be different for different athletes. And then I compare that. And I showed this is the same slide I showed in the season review. I'm looking at all the periods. And, what I do in my system, and I should have just shown it, part of me is just like, I'm like the worst secret keeper, as we know. I can't even hide my own processes. I just build this as a weekly line, and you can just do it by doing athlete range. Today -7, athlete range, today -7, today -14, or -8, really, to be mathematically correct. And then you just set up a range that way, and I just track it by weeks. I'm constantly looking what's happening. So there's nothing different in this report. I'm just using the compare function to be able to see change. Remember, we're looking at trend until trend hits a target of chronic. Two things that make me pay attention, that make me worried if the plan needs to tweak or adjusted. If trend isn't going in the right direction, and if chronic loads are not being achieved or being achieved too early. And then you can look at season to season, about the same thing. I use cluster analysis all the time. I really do. I find the more the athlete becomes efficient, economical, and fatigue resistant, the more they will cluster. It's funny, I've told the story before. I learned this from a very good World Tour pro team, a men's team, who tracked this very exclusively. And at first I was a little bit skeptical, and I didn't think it was, I thought it might not be the best answer. Well, that's what you get for second guessing some pretty smart guys. And the reality is, the more I use it and look at it, the more it really is indicative of coming on form, being on great form, and max peak. So to be able to look and track this through the season, and then now I'm beginning to understand, like, my chronic load is coming from this idea of clustering. So I think it has a high relevance in tracking. Stamina and fatigue resistance, I only gave you a little bit because there is a full webinar on those too. So if you haven't seen them, watch them. There's no dramatic reinvention of the wheel. I think the key learning here is I've shown some insight for you guys into what I'm looking at in the aerobic and cardiovascular side. But again, if you watched my annual planning and then my season review, it really is, to me, your analytics support your process. They don't invent them. So I have a process of working with an athlete to set a goal. That goal tells me certain milestones, if we remember that. And those milestones are the power outputs, the achievements, the things that we need to do to be able to set ourselves up for success. Those milestones then set the needs analysis, of which I'll write an annual training plan focused on, two things: ability of that rider, demand of their events. Then the analytics I put together support those forward-moving training plan. Are we achieving that, ongoing progress and the achievement of a certain critical performance or a chronic target, right? And then once we achieve that, we're actually seeing how far beyond it we can go. That it doesn't mean we just stop. As long as we're continuing to trend appropriately forward, we keep going. that's the easiest. So it is a certain, at the end of the season, we review on those same metrics, right? Reviewing the same analysis. And that now we add, we learn, we have new insight, because what we didn't cover is situational analytics. And this is where WKO4 to me is so strong. When you have something occur, like everything's trending down, that's when I start developing or looking at new analytics. What's going wrong here? I start looking at the analytics I have and I start trying to see a pattern. And in that pattern, what I'm trying to see is, wow, does that look like a lot of work? Does that look like a lot of fatigue resulting from that work? Is there a point where the athlete stopped adapting and I wasn't doing it right? What was the content? What was the goal? You know, you got to go back and look at that. So situational analytics probably could sit underneath all of this, but by nature, they're situational, so they're hard to present. If you gave me a situation, I might give you an analytic, but these are my basis. This is the periodization. And as long as those things are moving forward, and I'm constantly looking at, you know, some of the other data and things that we're doing and qualitative data, how the athlete feels and their feedback to me. And finally, you know, I had this on the list and I took it off because it opens a Pandora's box a little bit, their mental toughness. I use this time period to really make sure the athlete is ready to perform. You know, so whether we're dealing with some of the sports psychology side or we're learning how to work through some discomforts on the bike, you know, learning to suffer. You're not going that hard this time period totally, but still on the same side, just putting that in place is something I'll work on. So that's kind of just my overview of process. Again, I'm trying to keep it shorter. I will take, if you want to ask questions now, I've been answering. I think I've gotten everybody. So if I didn't answer yours, re-ask me now because there was a lot of them. Re-ask me now. I'm going to just drop that so I can pull this and open my Dropbox. Just put this over here. And I'm going to share this. So at least one person has to ask me for the charts so I can share it with everybody, because I'll respond to the group with the chart link, assuming I can make it work. I'm pretty sure I did it last night. Of course, I have a lot of things in Dropbox. Thanks, I see those. I'll get them. So who else has so now is the time to answer. I'm going to share the presentations now. What other questions do you have? Let's put them in right now. That's me stalling. Wow, that's really odd. Here we go. Yeah, wow, for some reason I know why. There you go. So I sent that to all. So you all should be able to receive that. I'm just kind of answering all questions with it now. Thanks for the compliment. That's very much appreciated. Hopefully, if no one's still seeing the charts, let me know. I'm sending it to a couple of different response, send to all. Sorry about that. I thought you guys had access to the charts, to the chat. I think once the webinar starts, it closes chat. So that's basically it. Watch the fatigue resistance, watch the stamina. I'll be a little more careful about the topics because that was too much crossover. I do, you know, appreciate everybody's patience, but there is other great stuff that you could build into that to look at it. The next webinar is on workout review, which, like I said, I'm excited to do. I'm actually working on it with Dean. Dean Golich, him and I were talking about it the other night. It's always fun to compare notes with a really smart guy. And, you know, I think it's going to be a great webinar. So make sure you sign up for that one because I think it's going to be really a lot more grassroots. It's going to be less slides and actually digging in to the WKO product. I've got permission from that World Tour male and another World Tour female to show you. So we'll show some ups and downs and some pretty cool stuff of some pretty cool files. So it should be a fun one. Okay. Excellent. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We'll talk to you soon. Bye now.